How many of you remember as a child, perhaps in Sunday school or a vacation Bible school or church camp, learning a song about Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, and he climbed up in a sycamore tree. What's the next line? So that he could see, right? How much more do you remember about Zacchaeus' story beyond the song? Some of those elements, right, that we just heard once again this morning. And it's interesting, I think, that Luke seems to have a particular fondness for the outcast, those who were considered maybe kind of an enemy of the people. You can think of the story of the Good Samaritan, which is in Luke. And here is this prominent story about a tax collector. Now, I know that many of you know of a certain tax collector, at least now retired, here in Clackamas County, and hopefully you have fond thoughts about that particular tax collector. But in the case of Jesus' day, the tax collectors were among the most hated, corrupt officials. They made their money on the backs of their kinfolk and neighbors in their local towns. They managed somehow to ingratiate themselves to the oppressive Roman forces and collected taxes on their behalf, really extracting the wealth of the land and the people and sending it off to the rulers of the empire. But what made them even more hated was that it was the very common practice for them to charge folks a little bit extra and then pocket the surplus. And so when we hear about Zacchaeus was a very rich man, we can probably assume that he was also a very corrupt official, enriching himself on the backs of his family, friends, and neighbors. So it's within that context then that I dare to ask the question for us to consider is, what is your Zacchaeus story? What is your Zacchaeus story? And by this, I particularly mean, what have you experienced in your lifetime, which is such a transformative watershed moment that you were one person, one moment, and the next moment, an entirely different person? There was the you before, and there's the you after. When have you experienced a watershed moment like that? For some today, online with us and here in the room, undoubtedly you've experienced tragic watershed moments when your life was suddenly changed by some horrific tragedy. Maybe a natural disaster, a wildfire that swept through the area and destroyed your home, or an earthquake, or a great wind like the Columbus Day storm, or even the great freeze of Valentine's Day a year and a half ago, or the smoke that we all were dealing with. So sometimes there are natural acts of God that can indeed transform our lives, right? But there's also just horrible accidents and tragedies, car accidents, violence that may take away someone you love far sooner in an unexpected way, and your life is forever changed. So there certainly are tragic circumstances in which our lives are immediately transformed from the before to the after. But there can also be, lovely, delightful, wonderful events as well, right? Anyone remember falling in love? Or perhaps getting married, having children, and then grandchildren, and some folks great-grandchildren? Perhaps there was a moment in time, perhaps there was a moment of love at first sight, or the moment of having a child placed in your arms for the first time, or maybe it was more of a slowly evolving process. For us who are of a certain age, either close to, pre, or post-retirement, retirement can be one of those watershed moments, right? I mean, there may be the pinpoint moment when you walk out the door and you never walk back again, at least not as an employee, right? But this process of growing into what retirement looks like for you, what it means for you, and what some people are calling now the third age. So there's like, childhood and youth and young adulthood, there's sort of middle adulthood, and then after retirement, it's like the third age. What are you going to be now when you grow up, right? So it can be an unfolding process as well. So again, I'm asking you to think about what some of your transformational watershed Zacchaeus moments have been like. And hopefully for many of us, there may be some balance between the tragic and the hopeful and reason for rejoicing. For me, I would say certainly the death of my parents were some of those watershed moments. And in some ways, I would say probably my father, more so in my mother, in that he died when I was much younger, 19 years before my mother. I was still really actively parenting at that time with a 16, a 13, and a 10-year-old children at home. And so somehow I think the loss of my father at that point and no longer having, that generation between me and eventuality somehow I think probably was more impactful. But then in 2019, my father-in-law died, my mother died, and 6 months later, my brother-in-law died as well. So we have these experiences that transform us. I remember one particular Zacchaeus moment for me, I would say, was when I was a high school exchange student. And I know I've talked a little bit to Carol Swedberg's daughter, Lynn, and I imagine she had somewhat of a similar experience where one moment, it's the you who grew up in America, right? And suddenly you're plunged, you're immersed into a whole different culture. For me, that was Brazil when I was 17 years old, and kind of what a shock, in a good way, it was to go from being the youngest among 4 children here, really being the only one left at home after my sister left for college, and becoming part of a family of 7 siblings when I was the second to the oldest, and many, many, many younger siblings. But probably the moment that I would pinpoint of transformation, the moment of the before and the after, was when I was on a bus ride from Rio de Janeiro to the capital, São Paulo, where my Brazilian family came to meet me. And I was among 20 exchange students who were then going to be heading off in all different direction from the city of São Paulo from the bus station. And I think I might have been the very last one of our group that was coming off the bus. And many of them, there were welcoming signs and banners and various things, but in my case, there was none of that. But when I stepped off of the bus, I saw this man beaming a huge smile at me and welcoming me with that smile, and that was my Brazilian exchange student father, Papai. And I really think that it was that moment where I was one person before that, and at that moment of being welcomed into that family, I was a different person. So much so that I was completely immersed with the family and the culture and the language and the customs. And it may be hard to believe this, but that immersion included going to high school several hours a day, spending time at home with my family, going to the sports club in the afternoon. And remarkably, I would say it took about 3 months of immersion before I began finding myself thinking in Portuguese and dreaming in Portuguese, and no longer like mechanically translating things, but there was like a Brazilian side of me that just began to emerge. And so much so that about 3 months after I was in country for the first time, my parents called on the telephone. It happened to be Easter weekend, and they wanted to say hello to me. And when I first got on the phone with them, I was having a hard time speaking to them in English. It's like it didn't compute, you know? That's how immersed I was. And I think really forever changed. Now, changed again after that year of a high school exchange when I went back to Brazil again with my wife and spent 3 more years there. So still, you know, changed over and over again. But I really think there was a before and an after. For me too, I would say certainly, you know, marriage and having children and now grandchildren, attending college and later on seminary. These were kind of slow transformative experiences. Or when I first was trained for over a year to become a hospital chaplain. These are slow transformative experiences. But again, what can you identify in your own life that it's either been a momentary, you know, watershed before and after, or maybe a long unfolding process, like, who knows, maybe an experience in education or employment or community service, you know, whatever the case might be. So looking then again at Zacchaeus and Zacchaeus' story, right? We know that he was by reputation a scoundrel, a corrupt public official, kind of local hated public enemy number one, that when he hears the word that this famous preacher who's doing some amazing things, who's from some little country bumpkin town in Galilee, is passing through Jericho, he is intrigued enough, he's curious enough that he wants to go and see and hear from himself. But the problem is that he is statutorily challenged, right? I mean, he's a small stature, right? And so he can't like see above all the crowds that are there in front of him, so he has to climb up in the tree so he can see for himself. But obviously, he didn't really want anyone seeing that he was there or even bothering with him. And so when Jesus like stops in his track and looks up and calls out to him, like, who knows what the neighbors might have been thinking at that point. You know, he says, Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, come on down. And perhaps they assumed that Jesus was going to, have a come to Jesus meeting with him, right? Set him straight. And yet what he says is, Zacchaeus, come on down because I'm going to have dinner at your house today. He didn't say, first you've got to get yourself right with God, and then I will dare to enter into your home. He just flat out said, Zacchaeus, come down because you're going to host me at your house today. And so it was that overwhelming grace that there was a Zacchaeus before that moment of Jesus' invitation and a whole different Zacchaeus after that, right? And we know that because when he comes down, he proclaims, right, that he will give half of his wealth to the poor, and anyone he's defrauded, he will give back 4 times what he had taken illicitly from them. So he's transformed. He's a new person, a new creation. So my curiosity for us is, what might it look like in our lives these days to have these kind of Zacchaeus transformative watershed moments? What might it mean for us individually, and what might it mean for St. Paul's as a church? Could you imagine what St. Paul's as a church how it might look differently after than it looks before? I mean, we can certainly look at COVID, and there's a St. Paul's church before COVID, and there's a St. Paul's church kind of still coming through what we hope is the beginning of the end of COVID. Who knows? There may be another wave, right? But we do know that we can look back and see something of the before. We don't really know yet what the after will look like. And I think largely it's up to us here online today and in the room today, working together amongst ourselves. And I would say, most particularly, not only working just amongst our own group, but working with our other community partners to determine what St. Paul's after will look like. So how might the grace of God be calling us and freeing us, redeeming us, transforming us, empowering us in our Zacchaeus moments as a church. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll spend some time considering in the days to come. So as we pray for our larger denomination, the United Methodist Church, and the emerging leaders and election of bishops in our church, I hope also that we'll be praying for St. Paul's and what St. Paul's may look like in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. Our invitation for the stewardship campaign is to think about the new covenant that God is inviting us into for 2023. So how is it that God is calling us to be transformed and to live as Zacchaeus lived, committed to hospitality and generosity? Thanks be to God. Amen.